There was a plant that American scientists in the 1970s called nature's swamp supermarket. They calculated that it could produce more than 10 to 20 tons of starch per hectare from its underground parts. That is equal to or higher than corn growing on dry land. And it does all of this in wetlands while at the same time cleaning the water around it, pulling out nitrogen and phosphorus from polluted rivers and lakes. Every part of it can be eaten. The stems, the leaves, the roots, the young shoots, the pollen, and even the seeds. 6 different food types from one single plant, and the starch it produces is in some ways superior to potatoes. It filters dirty water on its own. It turns marshes into open food gardens with no chemical inputs at all. No fertilizer, no pesticides, no irrigation, no replanting each year. And yet, more than 50 years later, most people only know it as a weed. A nuisance plant that grows densely in rivers and lakes, sprayed with herbicides, cut down with machines, blamed for clogging canals and drainage systems. This plant is called cattail. It is a tall reed that has been quietly drained out of human food culture during the last century. Not by accident, but because it threatens a model of agriculture built on annual seed sales, fertilizers, pesticides, and large monocultures. And before we go any further, I want to be honest about what this is. Everything I'm sharing here is built from verifiable historical records, published studies, and documented traditional uses. I am not a doctor, and I am not telling you to replace your meals with wild plants overnight. I am telling you what disappeared from public awareness and why. If you have ever walked past a marsh and thought there is nothing there, this might be the most useful 15 minutes you spend this week. Let us go back to the 1970s. At that time, several governments and research institutions were genuinely worried about food security. The world was searching for crops that could grow on marginal land, in poor soil, with little or no industrial input. And cattail kept coming up in the reports. A paper published in the journal Economic Botany in 1975 asked a direct question: cattails, weed problem or potential crop? The authors described the rhizomes as extremely rich in starch. Other studies from researchers in the United States and Europe confirmed that cattail could help fill protein and starch gaps in regions where wet soils made conventional crops difficult to grow. Indigenous peoples in North America had used it for centuries. The Iroquois, the Paiute, and many others dug up the rhizomes in autumn, stored them through the winter, and relied on them as a stable source of starch when the snow covered everything else. They collected the pollen carefully, mixed it with other flours, and baked it into cakes or thick porridge. In parts of Asia and Europe, the same uses had existed for almost as long as written history. Then something strange happened. After those promising early evaluations, deeper research stopped. Funding dried up. No major program pushed cattail as a real crop. Instead, in many states, especially in the case of certain hybrid populations, it was quietly added to lists of noxious or invasive plants, marked for eradication. At the same time, the United States was draining hundreds of thousands of acres of wetlands every year, losing more than half of its original wetland area during the 20th century. Most of that land was converted into corn and soybean monoculture. And every year on those new fields, farmers had to buy fertilizers, pesticides, and new seeds. Every season, the dependency loop reset. Cattail, sitting quietly in the marsh next door, needed none of it. Now let us look at what cattail actually offers, because once you see the full picture, it becomes very hard to keep calling it a weed. Below the mud, cattail grows long, swollen rhizomes. They contain between 30 and 46% starch by dry weight. They can be boiled, roasted, mashed, or processed into a fine flour. Protein content runs around 6 to 8%, which is roughly 3 times higher than common potatoes. Compared with corn or rice, cattail rhizomes give you similar starch, with notably higher calcium. You can prepare them the same way you would prepare a potato, but you are working with a more nutrient-dense food, growing on land nobody pays for. Early in the growing season, before the flowers appear, The plant pushes up tender young shoots. They are pale, crisp, and mild. Many people who have tried them compare the flavor to a cross between cucumber and asparagus. They are rich in vitamin C, and they can be eaten raw in salads or quickly cooked. Research summarized in nutritional databases puts crude protein in those young shoots at around 8.7 to 8.8%. That is significantly higher than the protein content of spinach. They also provide a small amount of healthy plant fats. Compared with commercial asparagus, cattail shoots grow without irrigation systems, without fertilizer, and without a single chemical input. Then comes the flowering stage. The male flower sits at the top of the spike and releases a fine yellow pollen. You can collect it by tilting the flower head into a paper bag and shaking. Dried and stored properly, that pollen behaves like a flower. According to nutritional reports, it contains around 20 to 25% protein. That is higher than wheat flour, which usually sits in the range of 10 to 13%. You can use this pollen to make pancakes, mix it into bread dough, or use it as a natural substitute for expensive protein powders. It is one of the most overlooked free protein sources in temperate ecosystems. Bees collect their own pollen because they understand its value. Humans walked past the same resource for decades because nobody was paid to advertise it. The leaves and the inner stems also contribute to the picture. The leaves can be cooked as a green vegetable, and they carry useful amounts of potassium and magnesium. The inner core of the stem, the part you reach after peeling away the tougher outer layers, is crisp and watery, similar in texture to a young cucumber. It carries vitamin A and vitamin C in amounts comparable to common garden vegetables. And finally, the seeds. They are small and easy to ignore, but they represent the end of the plant's energy cycle. When roasted or ground, they behave like a coarse grain and provide carbohydrates in a way that is similar to traditional cereals. So we have one plant providing greens from the leaves, fresh shoots like asparagus, a watery vegetable from the stem, starch from the rhizomes, protein flour from the pollen, and grain from the seeds. 6 different food categories from one organism that nobody plants, nobody fertilizes, and nobody waters. But the story does not end with food. Cattail also cleans the water it grows in. It pulls nitrogen and phosphorus directly out of wastewater. Some reports calculate uptake of up to 33 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare, which is a meaningful amount when you consider that excess phosphorus in rivers and lakes is one of the main causes of algal blooms and dead zones. Compared with other water-filtering plants, cattail is particularly effective in highly polluted areas, with strong carbon storage and nutrient retention. The total dry matter yield in wetland systems can reach 15 to 30 tons per hectare, which is higher than the average yield of corn on conventional fields. And the rhizomes alone can deliver 10 to 20 tons of starch in the same space. There is real historical evidence behind all of this. Indigenous communities across North America did not see wetlands as wasteland. They saw them as reliable food zones. In medieval and Roman Europe, cattail and similar marsh plants appeared in records as freshwater food sources. During the Second World War, the United States military seriously planned large-scale harvesting of cattail for starch and flour as a backup food source in case supply chains failed. The fluffy seed heads were used to fill life jackets. Those plans only stopped because the war ended and the agricultural system shifted into a different mode entirely. When American agriculture industrialized in the second half of the 20th century, cattail did not fit the new template. And there are 3 clear reasons why it was pushed out of the conversation. The first reason is that it cannot be mechanized in the same way as corn or wheat. Wetlands are not flat. The rhizomes grow tangled beneath the mud. The plants grow at uneven heights, in dense clumps with no clean rows. Modern harvesters need straight lines, uniform fields, and predictable timing. Cattail refuses all of that. The second reason is that it cannot be controlled the way industrial crops are controlled. It spreads through underground rhizomes. You do not have to buy seed every year. One piece of root left in the mud, and it returns. There is no annual sale, no patent, no corporate input package. The third reason is that it does not store or transport well in industrial systems. The rhizomes spoil quickly if they are not processed soon after harvest. The pollen and the young shoots have short seasons. It does not package neatly. It does not become a global commodity. It is a local food for local people. And local food does not generate the kind of margins that supply chains are built around. There was never a formal ban. There did not need to be. What happened was much quieter. Funding moved elsewhere. Recommendations and incentives pushed toward eradication, especially of hybrid populations in disturbed wetlands. Drainage projects continued. New crops took the spotlight, and cattail slowly became a word that meant nuisance, not food. Recent research even confirms that cattail expansion in many regions is driven mostly by human-altered water flow and the runoff of excess nutrients from industrial agriculture. The monoculture model creates the exact conditions where cattail thrives and then blames the plant for the consequences. So what can you actually do with this information? First, you can learn to recognize the plant. Cattail grows in clumps between 1 and 3 meters tall. The leaves are long, narrow, and stand upright like sword blades. The flower spike is unmistakable. A dense brown cylinder that looks a bit like a sausage attached to a stem, with the male pollen producing part above and the female part below. You will see it in marshes, along lake edges, in slow canals, and on calm river banks. It is one of the most common wetland plants in temperate regions. Safety matters. Cattail is not poisonous, but like every wild plant, the rule is the right part, at the right time, from the right place. Only harvest from clean water. Avoid roadside ditches, agricultural runoff zones, and any wetland near industrial discharge. The young shoots in spring can be peeled and eaten raw or lightly cooked while they are still tender. In early summer, when the male flower is releasing pollen, bend it gently over a paper bag and tap to collect that yellow dust. The rhizomes are dug from the mud, washed thoroughly, peeled, and then boiled for 20 to 30 minutes, roasted or dried and ground into flour. Do not eat large amounts of raw starch from the roots, because raw starch is hard to digest and can cause stomach discomfort. The seeds can be roasted in a dry pan, almost like very small popcorn. If you actually want cattail near you and it does not grow there already, you usually do not need to plant it in the traditional sense. In most regions, it arrives on its own wherever there is still water and exposed mud. If you want to introduce it deliberately into a small pond edge or a managed wetland, look for suppliers of native aquatic plants rather than general agricultural seed companies. A single living rhizome segment pressed into wet soil will usually establish itself. It does not need fertilizer. It does not need weekly attention. It only needs water and space. You do not have to change your entire diet to make use of this knowledge. Start with one small experiment. Take the tender white inner part of a young shoot, slice it thinly, add olive oil, lemon, and a little salt. You will get a crisp, fresh salad that tastes cleaner than most store-bought vegetables. Or mix 1 part dried pollen with 3 parts wheat flour, add an egg and a little milk, and bake small pancakes. They turn out golden, slightly nutty, and rich in protein in a way ordinary pancakes are not. The first time you do this, something shifts in how you think about food. You begin to understand that the supermarket is one option, not the only one. Now imagine the future that researchers and farmers are already starting to talk about openly. Longer droughts, cracked fields, soil that has been pushed too hard for too many decades, sudden floods that drown the same farmland the next season, fertilizer prices that swing wildly with energy markets. Almost every modern crop fails in the same situations. They need stable water, fertile soil, and steady chemical inputs. Cattail does not depend on any of that. It survives in remaining wet pockets during drought. It thrives where soils have been damaged by excess nitrogen and phosphorus because it absorbs those exact compounds. It holds riverbanks during floods and keeps building starch under the mud. I want to be clear about one thing before we finish. I am not telling you to go and tear out wetlands or strip them bare. Wetlands are some of the most valuable ecosystems on the planet, and cattail is part of those ecosystems, not a resource to exploit. The point is not to harvest until there is nothing left. The point is to understand that food does not always come from rectangular fields and seed packets. It also comes from marshes, river edges, and quiet lake shores that most people walk past without noticing. Every time someone learns to identify cattail, prepares it once, or simply allows it to grow freely in a corner of their land, a small piece of dependency gets returned to nature. The reports from the 1970s are still on shelves. The traditional knowledge is still alive in many communities. The plant is still everywhere. The only thing that has been missing is attention. If a familiar riverbank or marsh near you suddenly looks different after this video, that is the point. If you know someone worried about food prices, water pollution, or where agriculture is heading, share it with them. And if you want to keep uncovering plants the system quietly buried, subscribe to the channel and stay for the next one. A plant that comes back every year on its own, feeds you in 6 different ways, and cleans the water it grows in, was labeled a nuisance because it does not fit a model built on selling you the same inputs every season. One plant, one wetland, one meal at a time. That model can be questioned.